I didn't expect to see him there. The sky had been colorless all morning, the kind of pale gray that sits heavy over everything and makes the world feel smaller. Colder. Like the air itself had gone numb. There were maybe 30 people gathered around the grave, all of them dressed in black or something close to it. Scarves. Gloves. That careful, quiet posture people take on when they don't know what else to do with their grief. I stood between my father and my aunt, hands folded in front of me, staring at the casket like if I looked long enough it might start to make sense. It didn't. My suit was too tight around the collar. I'd borrowed it from my cousin, and it smelled faintly of mothballs and something sweet I couldn't place. My throat ached. Not from crying, I hadn't cried yet, but from the effort of holding everything in, from staying upright, from nodding at people who said things like she was so wonderful, and I'm so sorry, and if you need anything at all. I didn't need anything. I needed her back. But no one says that at funerals. The priest was saying something about light and love and eternal rest, and I wasn't listening. I was counting the seconds until I could leave, until I could go back to the house and sit in my old bedroom and stop pretending I was holding it together. Then someone touched my elbow. It wasn't rough. It wasn't insistent. Just a light tap like a question. I turned, blinking against the dull brightness of the overcast sky, and for a moment I didn't recognize him. Tall, broader in the shoulders than I remembered, dark hair a little longer than it used to be, falling just over his forehead. He was wearing a charcoal coat, hands shoved deep in the pockets, and his expression was uncertain in a way that felt completely foreign on his face. Seth McAllister. I blinked again. My brain was slow, sluggish like it had been for days. Seth. Here. At my mother's funeral. We hadn't spoken in 4 years. Maybe 5. Not since we graduated high school and went our separate ways. Him to some prestigious college out east, me to a state school 3 hours north. We didn't keep in touch. We didn't have that kind of relationship. We had the kind where we spent 12 years trying to destroy each other in the most socially acceptable ways possible. Spelling bees, debate tournaments, science fairs, every academic competition our small town could throw at us, we turned into a battlefield. He beat me more often than I beat him, and I hated him for it. Or I thought I did. Now he was here, standing 2 feet away from me at my mother's funeral, and I had no idea what to say. He nodded once, hesitant, like he wasn't sure if I'd want him there. I wasn't sure either. He shifted his weight, glanced at the casket, then back at me. His voice was quieter than I remembered, softer. He said he didn't know if he should come. I heard myself ask why he did. He didn't answer right away. He looked at me for a long moment, and there was something in his eyes I couldn't name. Something that wasn't pity, but wasn't indifference either. He said, finally, that I looked like I needed someone who remembered the same things I did. I didn't know what to say to that. I wasn't sure what he meant. What things? What memories? We'd spent our entire childhood competing, clashing, circling each other like rival animals in a too small cage. What was there to remember besides the fights? Besides the resentment? But then he did something I didn't expect. He reached for my hand. Not dramatically. Not like it was some grand gesture. Just a quiet movement, his fingers brushing against mine, then closing gently around them. His hand was warm, steady, real in a way nothing else had felt in days. I stared down at our hands. His thumb rested lightly against my knuckles. I could feel the faint calluses on his palm, the way his fingers fit against mine like they'd done this before, even though they hadn't. Ever. I didn't pull away. I don't know why. Maybe because I was too tired, too hollowed out. Maybe because no one else had touched me like that. Like I was fragile but not broken, like I was worth holding on to since my mother died. My father had clapped my shoulder once, stiff and silent. My aunt had hugged me too hard, smelling of lavender and old perfume. But this was different. Seth wasn't trying to fix me. He wasn't trying to say the right thing. He was just there, standing beside me, holding my hand while the priest finished the prayer and people started to shift, murmuring, preparing to leave. I kept staring at our hands, at the way his fingers curled around mine, at the contrast between his pale skin and my olive-toned knuckles, at the fact that Seth McAllister, the boy who once told me my favorite band sounded like dying cats, the boy who pulled my hair in 5th grade and laughed when I cried, The boy who beat me in every spelling bee we ever competed in was here, holding my hand. At my mother's funeral, I didn't understand it, but I didn't let go. The service ended. People began to move, slow and solemn, back toward their cars. My father touched my shoulder briefly, said something about heading to the house. My aunt was already walking away, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. Seth's hand was still in mine. I looked up at him. His face was serious, eyes steady on mine. There was no smirk, no challenge, no trace of the boy who used to infuriate me just by existing. Just someone who looked like he understood what it meant to stand at the edge of a grave and feel like the ground might give way beneath you. He didn't say anything else. He didn't have to. He just stood there, patient and quiet, until I finally loosened my grip, until I let his hand slip from mine. He nodded once more, a small, almost imperceptible acknowledgement. Then he turned and walked toward the parking lot, coat flaring slightly in the wind. I watched him go, watched him disappear between the rows of headstones and leafless trees. And for the first time since my mother died, I felt something other than numbness. I felt confused and angry and strangely, impossibly grateful. I didn't know what to do with any of it, but I knew, somehow, that this wasn't the last time I'd see him. I grew up in the same house my entire life. 3 blocks from the elementary school, 2 from the library, 5 from the lake where everyone went in summer to pretend the water wasn't too cold. It was the kind of neighborhood where people knew each other's names, where my mother could walk to the grocery store and come back an hour later with 3 bags and 5 new pieces of gossip. She loved it here, loved the familiarity, the routines, the way Mrs. Chan next door would bring over dumplings on Sundays, and how Mr. Reyes down the street still had Christmas lights up in March because he said they made people smile. My mother was like that too. She made people smile. She was warm in a way that felt intentional, like she decided early on that the world needed more softness, and she was going to provide it whether anyone asked or not. She ran the community theater for 15 years, directed every production, painted sets in our garage, came home smelling of paint thinner and fabric glue. She made pasta from scratch every Saturday. She read 3 books a week and left them scattered around the house with bookmarks made from grocery receipts. She was the heart of every room she entered. Everyone said so at the funeral. I didn't know how to be in a room without her. Her death was sudden, a blood clot in her lung. She'd been complaining about shortness of breath for 2 days, said she thought she was getting a cold. My father told her to rest. She did. She went to bed early on a Tuesday and didn't wake up Wednesday morning. No warning. No time to say anything that mattered. No chance to tell her I loved her one more time, even though I'd said it 100 times before and it never felt like enough. I'd been 3 hours away when it happened. Finishing my first year of grad school, buried in research and thesis proposals, and the kind of exhausting, all-consuming work I thought I wanted. My father called at 6 in the morning. I heard his voice, and I knew before he said anything. I just knew. I came home that afternoon, walked into the house, and it smelled the same, like lavender and old books and whatever candle she'd been burning in the living room. But she wasn't there, and the smell felt wrong without her, like a memory trying to be real. I've been numb ever since. I took a leave from school. My advisor said it'd take all the time I needed, said grief doesn't follow a schedule. I nodded and signed the paperwork and moved back into my childhood bedroom like the last 4 years hadn't happened. Like I was 16 again, sleeping under the same glow-in-the-dark stars I'd stuck to the ceiling in middle school. Everything in this house reminded me of her. The kitchen where she'd taught me to make risotto. The reading chair by the window where she'd spent every evening with a book and a cup of tea. The framed photos lining the hallway. Me at every age, gap-toothed and awkward and smiling because she was behind the camera. I couldn't look at them for long. I hadn't seen Seth McAllister since we both left for college. We didn't keep in touch. There was nothing to keep. Our entire relationship had been built on competition, on the need to prove we were smarter, faster, better than the other. We've been rivals since 3rd grade, when he beat me in the school spelling bee and I cried in the bathroom for 20 minutes. After that, it was war, debate club, science fairs, math competitions, essay contests. Every opportunity to outdo each other, we took. He won more often than I did. which only made me try harder, made me resent him more. People in town thought it was funny. Cute, even. The two smart kids always going head-to-head. Teachers loved it. Our parents pretended to be above it, but secretly kept score. We weren't friends. We were never friends. But we knew each other better than most people did. We knew how the other thought, how they argued, what they cared about enough to fight for. We'd spent 12 years circling each other, pushing each other, locked in a rivalry that defined us both. And then we graduated. He went east. I went north. And that was it. I didn't think about him much after that. Occasionally I'd wonder if he was doing well, if he was still winning everything he touched. But mostly I moved on. Build a life that didn't revolve around beating Seth McAllister at something, until he showed up at my mother's funeral. I still didn't understand why he came. We hadn't spoken in years. We were close. We barely qualified as acquaintances. But he'd been there, standing beside me while they lowered her into the ground, holding my hand like it was the most natural thing in the world. And when he left, when his hand slipped from mine and he walked away through the cemetery, I felt the absence of him, which made no sense. Nothing made sense anymore. I was living in a house full of ghosts, sleeping in a room that hadn't changed since high school, grieving a woman who'd been the center of my entire world. And somehow, in the middle of all that, Seth McAllister had reappeared, quiet, different, still familiar in ways I didn't want to examine, still infuriating, still impossible to ignore. The memorial gathering happened 2 days after the funeral. My father insisted. He said my mother would have wanted people to come together, to share stories, to eat too much and laugh when they remembered her. He was probably right. She loved gatherings, loved filling the house with noise and warmth and the chaos of too many people in one space. I hated every minute of it. The house was full of neighbors and distant relatives and people from the theater company. They brought casserole dishes and plastic-wrapped cookies and sympathy cards with generic messages inside. They sat in mismatched chairs pulled from every room, balanced paper plates on their laps, told the same stories over and over. How she'd helped with the spring musical. How she'd organized the neighborhood watch. How she'd made the best carbonara anyone had ever tasted. I smiled when I was supposed to, nodded, said thank you probably 100 times. My voice felt mechanical. My face hurt from holding the same expression for hours. I needed to get away. I slipped upstairs while my aunt was telling someone about the time my mother accidentally dyed all the theater costumes pink. No one noticed me leave. Or if they did, they had the grace not to follow. My bedroom was exactly as I'd left it that morning. Bed unmade. Curtains half drawn. The same pile of clothes on the chair I'd been meaning to deal with for 3 days. I closed the door behind me, and the noise from downstairs became muffled, distant, manageable. I sat on the floor, back against the bed, knees pulled up. I closed my eyes and tried to remember how to breathe normally. That's when I heard the knock. Soft, tentative. Then the door opened a crack, and Seth looked in. He said my name like a question. I didn't tell him to leave. I didn't tell him to stay either. I just looked at him, and he seemed to take that as permission because he stepped inside and closed the door quietly behind him. He stood there for a moment, hands in his pockets, looking around the room like he was seeing it for the first time. The posters on the walls. The bookshelf overflowing with paperbacks. The desk covered in old photos and forgotten trinkets. Then he crossed the room and sat down on the carpet beside me. Not too close, but close enough that I could feel his presence. Solid. Real. We didn't say anything at first. Just sat there in the strange, heavy silence of my childhood bedroom while the sounds of the gathering drifted up through the floorboards. Seth's gaze landed on the desk. He leaned forward slightly, reached up, and picked up a photo I'd forgotten was there. I knew which one it was before I even looked. The two of us at the regional spelling bee in 7th grade. We'd both made it to the final round. We were standing side by side in the photo, waiting for the results, and we looked like we wanted to kill each other. Fists clenched, eyes narrowed, jaws tight. He won. I came in second. I didn't speak to him for a month. Seth stared at the photo for a long moment, then glanced at me. There was something almost gentle in his expression. I said we hated each other. He looked back at the photo, turned it over in his hands. Then he asked, did we? It wasn't really a question. Or maybe it was. I didn't know how to answer. Because I had hated him, hadn't I? I'd hated how easily things came to him, how he never seemed nervous before competitions, how he smiled when he won, like it was inevitable, like I was never really a threat. But sitting there on the floor of my bedroom, with him holding that photo like it was something precious instead of proof of our endless antagonism, I wasn't sure anymore. Maybe hate was just the easier word, the safer one. He set the photo back on the desk carefully, like it mattered. Then he leaned back against the bed beside me, shoulder almost touching mine. We sat like that for a while, not talking, not needing to. It felt familiar in the strangest way, like we'd done this before, even though we hadn't. We'd never been in the same room without competing, without throwing words at each other like weapons. But now there was nothing to win. No prize, no audience, just two people sitting on a carpet, surrounded by the remnants of a childhood that felt impossibly far away. Eventually, people started leaving. I heard car doors closing, voices calling goodbye, my father's low murmur as he thanked someone for coming. Seth stood first, said he should probably go. I got to my feet, followed him downstairs. The house was quieter now. A few people lingered in the kitchen, helping my aunt wrap up leftovers. Seth grabbed his coat from the hook by the door. I walked him out onto the porch. The air was cool, crisp. The sky was starting to darken at the edges. He turned to face me, one hand on the railing. There was something in his expression I couldn't read, something uncertain. I asked if he wanted to meet for coffee tomorrow. The words came out before I'd really thought about them, before I could talk myself out of it. Seth blinked. Then, slowly, he smiled. It was a small smile, cautious, but real. He said only if I promised not to throw it at him. I almost smiled back. Almost. He left after that, walked down the steps and out to his car. I stood on the porch and watched him drive away, watched his taillights disappear around the corner. And for the first time in days, I felt something other than the weight of grief pressing down on me. I felt curious, maybe even hopeful. I wasn't sure what I just started, but I knew I wanted to find out. We started meeting in quiet places, spaces where we could talk without being interrupted, without running into people who remembered us as the kids who used to argue about everything from calculus to chemo. The first time was at a coffee shop downtown. Neutral territory. Safe. But it felt too bright, too exposed. Too many people who might recognize us. So the next day, Seth suggested the lake. There was a bench on the north side, half hidden by willow trees, where hardly anyone went. We sat there for 3 hours. I don't remember what we talked about at first. Small things, probably. Safe things. But somewhere in the middle of that conversation, something shifted. The careful politeness fell away, and we started talking the way people do when they're tired of pretending everything is fine. Seth told me about his mother's cancer scare last year, how they'd found a lump, how he'd driven home every weekend for 2 months, sitting in waiting rooms, holding her hand through test results, how it turned out to be benign, but the fear had changed something in him, made him realize how much of his life he'd spent chasing things that didn't matter, trying to impress people he didn't even like. He said he'd left law school after that, just walked away in the middle of his second year. His father hadn't spoken to him for 3 months. I asked him what he was doing now. He said he was figuring it out, working at a bookstore, reading, trying to remember what he actually wanted instead of what everyone expected him to want. I understood that more than I wanted to admit. I told him I didn't know who I was without someone to fight, that my entire identity had been built on competition, on winning, on proving I was good enough. And now that my mother was gone, the person who'd loved me regardless of whether I won or lost, I felt untethered, like I'd been running towards something my entire life and suddenly couldn't remember why. Seth didn't try to fix it, didn't offer empty reassurances. He just listened, nodded, said he understood loneliness that shows up when the world stops clapping. That's when I realized we were having a real conversation. Not the kind where you're waiting for your turn to talk. The kind where you're actually listening, actually hearing each other. We started meeting every day after that, sometimes at the lake, sometimes at the secondhand bookstore where Seth worked, sitting in the back corner, surrounded by stacks of old paperbacks that smelled like dust and nostalgia. Sometimes at the diner on Maple Street that still served milkshakes in tin cups and had the same red vinyl booze I remembered from childhood. We talked about everything. Our families, our fears, the futures we'd imagined, and the ones we were living. We argued sometimes, but it felt different now. Less like warfare and more like exploration. Like we were trying to understand each other instead of defeat each other. One afternoon, Seth suggested we revisit some of the old places, the ones that had been battlegrounds when we were younger. We drove to the soccer field behind the middle school. I hadn't been there in years. The grass was overgrown in places, the goalposts rusted. We stood at the center of the field, and I remembered the day we'd screamed at each other over a referee's call. We'd both been 12, both convinced we were right, both too stubborn to let it go. Seth said he'd gone home and cried that day. Said he'd felt humiliated. Said he'd hated me for making him feel small. I told him I'd done the same thing. We sat down right there in the middle of the field, side by side in the grass. And this time, there was nothing to fight about. No game, no score. Just two people looking at the same memory from different angles and realizing how much energy we'd wasted on something that didn't matter anymore. Another day, we went to the community center, the theater where my mother had spent so much of her life. It was closed for renovations, but we could see through the windows. The stage looked smaller than I remembered. The seats were covered in dust cloths. I told Seth about the year I'd auditioned for the lead in the spring musical. How I'd wanted it so badly. How Seth had wanted it too. How I'd gotten the part, and he'd barely spoken to me for the entire rehearsal period. He said he'd been jealous. Said watching me on that stage had made him realize I had something he didn't. A kind of unself-consciousness. A willingness to be vulnerable in front of people. I never thought of it that way. We stood there looking through those windows, and I felt something loosen in my chest. Some old resentment I'd been carrying without realizing it. Seth turned to me and said we'd spent so much time trying to beat each other that we'd never stopped to see each other. He was right. Every memory I had of him was filtered through competition, through the need to win. But sitting beside him now in all these places that used to feel like battlefields, I was seeing him clearly for the first time. Not as a rival, as a person, someone who'd been just as scared as I was, just as desperate to prove something, just as lonely. And the strangest part was that being with him didn't feel like losing. It felt like finally being able to rest. It happened on the porch, 3 weeks after the funeral, late enough that the neighborhood had gone quiet, early enough that we weren't ready to say goodnight. We'd spent the evening at the diner, talked until the waitress started stacking chairs on tables around us. Then Seth drove me home, and we ended up sitting on the front steps like we were teenagers again, except we'd never done this as teenagers. We'd never just sat together, never let the silence stretch out comfortable and warm between us. The porch light was off. My father had already gone to bed. The only illumination came from the street lamp half a block down, casting everything in soft yellow shadow. Seth had his elbows on his knees, hands clasped loosely in front of him. I was leaning back against the railing, looking up at the sky. There were more stars visible than I remembered. Or maybe I just hadn't been paying attention before. I said his name. He turned to look at me. I said, "You hold my hand." At the funeral, he nodded slowly, didn't look away. I told him I didn't think. I just did. There was something in his voice, something careful, like he was aware he might be crossing a line, but couldn't help himself. I said it helped. The words came out quieter than I intended, more vulnerable, but they were true. It had helped. His hand in mine had been the only solid thing in a day that felt like I was drowning. The only moment I'd felt tethered to something real. A long pause settled between us. Not uncomfortable, just heavy with things neither of us knew how to say yet. Then Seth spoke. He said he'd been thinking about me for years. I felt something shift in my chest, a kind of free-fall feeling. I turned to look at him fully. I said, "You hated me." He shook his head. Slow, deliberate. His eyes didn't leave mine. He said that's what he told himself when what he really felt scared him. I stopped breathing. The night air felt suddenly thinner. Everything around us, the street lamp, the houses, the distant sound of a car passing, all of it faded into background noise. There was only Seth, only his voice, only the way he was looking at me like he'd been carrying this for so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to finally set it down. I didn't know what to say. My mind was racing and blank at the same time. All those years, all that anger, all those arguments and competitions and moments where I'd convinced myself he was the enemy, and he'd been scared of what he felt. For me, I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. I closed it again, tried to organize my thoughts into something coherent. Failed. From inside the house, I heard the faint sound of a glass being set down in the kitchen. My father, probably getting water before bed. It was such an ordinary sound, such a normal moment, and yet everything felt different, tilted, like the world had shifted a few degrees to the left, and I was still trying to find my balance. Seth hadn't moved, hadn't looked away. He was just sitting there, patient and steady, letting me process, letting me catch up to what he'd just said. I leaned forward, not thinking, just moving. I pressed my forehead against his. It wasn't a kiss. It wasn't anything I could name. Just the gentle pressure of skin against skin. His breath warm on my face. His presence solid and real and impossibly close. He didn't pull back. We stayed like that. Foreheads touching. Eyes closed. Breathing in sync. I felt his hand find mine. Fingers threading together the same way they had at the funeral. Except this time it wasn't grief that brought us together. This time it was something else. Something that had been building for weeks. Or maybe for years. Maybe for our entire lives, and we'd just been too stubborn to see it. I didn't know how long we sat there. Could have been seconds. Could have been an hour. Time felt irrelevant. When I finally pulled back, Seth's eyes were still closed. He opened them slowly, looked at me with an expression I'd never seen on his face before. Vulnerable, hopeful, terrified. I wanted to say something. Wanted to tell him I understood. That maybe I'd been scared too. That maybe all that fighting had been easier than admitting there was something else underneath it. Something I didn't have words for. Something that felt too big and too fragile to acknowledge. But I didn't say any of that. I just held his hand, kept my eyes on his, let the silence say what I couldn't. A night breeze moved through the trees. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked once, then went quiet. Seth smiled. Small, uncertain, but real. And I realized this was a beginning. Not as something I could define or categorize or give a name to. Just a beginning. A shift. A moment where everything changed and nothing changed all at once. We didn't need to label it. We didn't need to figure it all out tonight. We just needed this. Each other. This quiet understanding that something had shifted between us and there was no going back. And for the first time in weeks, I didn't want to go back. I wanted to stay right here. The call came on a Tuesday morning. I was still in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself to get up. My phone buzzed on a nightstand, and I almost didn't answer. But I saw my advisor's name on the screen, and something in me knew this was important. She asked how I was doing. I said fine. She didn't believe me, but she didn't push. Then she told me they needed me back. Classes resumed in a week. My research project was waiting. My desk in a lab was still there. My fellowship was still active. Everything was ready for me to return. If I wanted to. She said it gently, like she knew what she was asking. I thanked her, told her I'd think about it, hung up and sat there with the phone in my hand, feeling like the ground had just opened up beneath me. I'd known this was coming. I couldn't stay in this house forever. Couldn't keep living in my childhood bedroom, suspended in grief, meeting Seth every day like we existed outside of real time. At some point, I had to go back to my life. The one I'd built 3 hours away. The one that was waiting for me, whether I was ready or not. But the thought of leaving made my chest tight. I told Seth over coffee that afternoon. We were at the diner, our usual booth by the window. He was halfway through a grilled cheese when I said it. Just put the words out there before I could talk myself out of them. My advisor called. They want me back next week. Seth set down his sandwich, wiped his hands on a napkin, looked at me with those steady eyes that had become so familiar over the past few weeks. I waited for disappointment, for him to ask me to stay, for some sign that this mattered to him as much as it did to me. Instead, he said I should go. I blinked, started to speak. He held up a hand. He said I should go, but come back, or ask him to visit, or just don't disappear. His voice was calm, reasonable, but there was something underneath it, something that sounded like fear being held carefully in check. I told him I didn't want to forget this. Forget him. I didn't say what I meant. That these weeks had changed something fundamental in me. That he'd become part of my grieving process. Yes, but also part of my healing. That the thought of going back to my apartment, my research, my life without him felt wrong. Incomplete. Seth leaned forward across the table. He said, then don't. Just 2 words. But they felt like permission, like an anchor I could hold on to. We didn't talk much after that. Just finished our food, paid the bill, walked out into the afternoon sun that felt too bright for the conversation we just had. Seth drove me home, parked in front of my house, and turned off the engine. We sat there in the silence of the car for a long moment. I told him I need to pack, figure out logistics, probably leave in a few days. He nodded. Then he said he'd drive me to the train station. The days before I left blurred together. I packed slowly, sorted through my things, threw away stuff I'd been holding on to for no reason. My father helped me carry boxes down from the attic. My aunt came over with Tupperware full of food she insisted I take back with me. Seth came by every evening. We didn't do anything special. Just sat on the porch, or walked around the neighborhood, or drove to the lake one last time. We didn't talk about what was happening between us. Didn't try to define it, or make plans, or figure out what this meant for the future. We just existed together, soaking up the time we had left. The morning I left, Seth pulled up in front of my house at 6. It was barely light out. The street was quiet. My father had already said goodbye, pressed a folded bill into my hand that I knew I wouldn't spend, told me to call when I got there. Seth helped me load my bags into his trunk. Then we drove to the station in silence. Not uncomfortable, just heavy. The platform was nearly empty. My train wasn't due for another 20 minutes. We stood there, hands in our pockets, looking at everything except each other. Then Seth reached into his jacket and pulled out a photo. It was the spelling bee picture, the one from my desk. The two of us glaring at the camera like we wanted to destroy each other and the world around us. I started to smile, but stopped when he turned it over. On the back, in his handwriting, it said, "You always made me want to be better." I looked up at him. He was watching me with that same expression from the porch. Vulnerable, hopeful, terrified. I didn't think, just stepped forward and wrapped my arms around him. He held me back, tight, like he was trying to memorize the shape of me. We stood there on the platform, holding each other while announcements echoed overhead and early morning commuters moved around us like water around stones. When I finally pulled back, Seth's eyes were wet. So were mine. The train pulled in. I picked up my bags. Seth said to call him when I got there. I said I would. He said he'd be waiting. I believed him. I got on the train, found a seat by the window, watched him standing on the platform, hands back in his pockets, that same patient posture I'd come to know so well. The train started moving. He raised one hand. I pressed my palm against the glass. And then he was gone. I sat back in my seat, put the photo in my jacket pocket, right over my heart, and let myself cry. 6 weeks passed. I fell back into the rhythm of grad school, the way you fall back in a muscle memory. Early mornings in the lab, afternoons buried in research papers, evenings spent writing and rewriting the same paragraph until the words stopped making sense. It was familiar, comfortable in a way that required no emotional energy. But something was different. I called Seth 3 times a week, sometimes more. We talk about small things, what I was reading, how his shift at the bookstore went, the weather, ordinary details that felt significant because we were sharing them, because we were choosing to stay connected across the distance. He sent me texts at random times, photos of books he thought I'd like, a shot of the lake at sunset, a terrible joke that made me smile despite myself. I kept the spelling bee photo on my desk, propped up against my lamp where I could see it while I worked. Some of my classmates asked about it. I told them it was an old friend. They didn't push for more, and I didn't offer. My apartment felt emptier than it had before. I'd lived here for over a year, but it had never quite felt like home. Now it felt even less so, like I was occupying space rather than living in it. Like part of me was still 3 hours away, sitting on a porch or walking by a lake or having coffee in a diner booth. I missed him. I hadn't expected that. Or maybe I had. Maybe I'd known the moment I got on that train that this was going to be harder than I wanted to admit. Then one morning, I found a postcard in my mailbox. The front showed a photograph of the lake. Our lake. The north side with the willow trees and the bench where we'd spent so many afternoons. The sky in the photo was painted in shades of orange and pink, the kind of sunset that only happens in late summer. I turned it over. The handwriting was Seth's. Small, careful, slanting slightly to the right. It said, "Come home soon." I found your mom's copy of Little Women, and I'm not giving it back unless you make me. S. I stood there in the hallway of my apartment building, holding that postcard, and felt something break open in my chest. Not sadness, not grief, something else. Something that felt like permission, like an invitation to stop pretending I was fine with the distance, to stop acting like I could just slot back into my old life and forget everything that had happened. I went back inside, set the postcard on my refrigerator with a magnet, stared at it while I made coffee. My mother's copy of Little Women, the one she'd read to me when I was young, the one with her notes in the margins and a coffee stain on page 47. I'd wondered where it was. Thought maybe it had gotten lost in the chaos after she died. Seth had found it. Of course he had. I picked up my phone, started to text him, stopped, deleted what I'd written. Instead, I opened my laptop, searched for train tickets home. There was one leaving Friday evening. I missed a seminar, but I could make it up. I could make everything up. I booked it. Then I sat back and looked at the postcard again. Read his words one more time. Come home soon. Home. He'd called a home. Maybe it was. Maybe it always had been, and I'd just been too focused on leaving to notice. I didn't tell Seth I was coming. I wanted it to be a surprise. Or maybe I was scared that if I told him, I'd talk myself out of it. Find a reason to stay here where things were safe and predictable and didn't require me to figure out what this thing between us actually was. The train ride felt longer than I remembered. I tried to read, but couldn't focus. Tried to sleep, but my mind wouldn't quiet. I just sat there watching the landscape change outside the window, feeling my pulse pick up the closer I got. By the time I arrived, it was late afternoon. The platform was busy with weekend travelers. I stepped off the train with my bag slung over my shoulder and looked around. And there he was, Seth, standing near the platform entrance. Hands in his pockets. Same patient posture. Same steady expression. He saw me and his whole face changed. Not a smile exactly. Something deeper. Relief mixed with joy mixed with something I didn't have a name for. I started walking toward him. Slowly at first. Then faster. He met me halfway. I dropped my bag. Reached for his hand. This time I reached first. His fingers closed around mine, and it felt like coming home in a way that had nothing to do with geography. Like finding a place I belonged that I hadn't known I'd been searching for. He said he got my train schedule from the website. Said he hoped it was okay that he came to meet me. I told him it was more than okay. We stood there on the platform, hands linked, people moving around us in both directions. Going home, leaving home, traveling to places they needed to be. And I realized that's what this was. Not grief that brought us together anymore. Not history or rivalry or unresolved feelings. Just choice. I chose to come back. He chose to be here waiting. We were choosing each other. Seth asked how long I could stay. I said the weekend. Maybe longer. I'd figure out. He smiled then. The real one. The one I've been seeing more of lately. He said that was enough. That any time was enough. We walked out of the station together, hand in hand, and for the first time since my mother died, I felt like I knew where I was going. Not back to who I used to be. Forward. Into something new. Into whatever this was becoming. Together.